St. Thomas Aquinas, great doctor of the church, says that the proper effect of receiving Holy Communion is to transform us so much into Christ that we can truly say, I live, now not I, but Christ lives in me. St. Thomas points out that the amount of grace we get when we receive a sacrament is proportional to our disposition at the very moment we receive the sacrament. In other words, the more prepared we are at the moment of reception, the more grace we receive. Another way of looking at it, or another way to say that is, the less prepared we are, the more obstacles we've placed to the action of a sacrament, the less grace we receive. The more prepared, the more grace. The less prepared, the less grace. What are the possible obstacles in us that are blocking the sanctifying action of the most blessed sacrament? This morning, we'll take a quick look at 7 possible obstacles to our sanctification. 7 things that may very well be keeping our spiritual arteries choked down or blocked. 7 obstacles that can prevent or retard our spiritual growth in communion. We'll briefly consider the first 6 obstacles and then spend a little more time developing the 7th, okay? Let's get started. The first possible obstacle, mortal sin. Just as a hamburger has absolutely no nutritional value to a dead man, so also Holy Communion is of absolutely no spiritual value to a spiritually dead man. Mortal sin is the same as saying spiritually dead. It's absolute and total barrier. Absolute, total barrier. We should rather die than commit a mortal sin. We're trying to get to heaven. We die without mortal sin. We've got it made. That's the first and most serious barrier. Second possible obstacle, deliberate venial sin. Deliberate venial sins. These are ones done with attention, perfect deliberation. They completely close off our path to holiness. We're not talking about venial sins that we commit out of weakness, out of surprise, out of lack of attention. Without special graces from God, the Council of Trent teaches, we can't avoid those kind of venial sins, what we might call semi-deliberate venial sins. But deliberate, cold-blooded venial sins, where we decide, all right, I know this is insulting you, God. I know that I'm showing contempt for you, God, but it's not serious enough to send me for hell, so I'll just do it. That sort of venial sin, that sort of contempt for God, makes it impossible for us to grow in holiness at Holy Communion. How can we be constantly, if we're going to commit deliberate venial sins, not by accident, but just cold-blooded do it like that, and then come to communion and ask Him to make us holy? They don't work together. Third possible obstacle, a lack of generosity in pursuing God's will and uniting our will to His, dodging crosses that God sends us, not embracing His clear will when we clearly see it. I'll quote a spiritual writer, quote, to advance there must be great fidelity to God's will. Rules and all other manifestations of God's desires must be faithfully followed. One's own daily duties have to be carried out with great exactness and watchful purity of intention. There is need of generosity in refusing God nothing for which He is clearly asking. The more one abandons oneself to God's will by cheerfully accepting all His dispositions and lovingly trusting all His plans, the quicker he shall advance. Close quote, Father Eugene Boylan. So if God sends us sickness rather than health, adversity rather than prosperity, bad weather rather than good weather, crosses instead of caresses, and we whine, we complain, we deliberately dodge our daily duties, we're actually closing down our spiritual floodgates. So it's much, much more difficult to grow in holiness at each communion. It's one of the reasons this little book, that if you don't have, make sure you ask it. We've tried to give it out to everybody, Uniformly with God's Will, by St. Alphonsus Liguori, is so useful. We read this, we put this into practice, read it and reread it, and it will help us so much to overcome this obstacle. Mortal sin, venial sin are obvious. This sometimes is not as obvious. If we're whining about the weather, we might not think about that affecting our communion. It will. Fourth possible obstacle, lack of bodily mortification. That's why we have Lent. Quote, there can be no progress without a mortified life. Now this does not mean a life of great corporal penance. It is our self-love that we must mortify. We have to mortify our self-love and attempt extraordinary or unusual corporal penances without a clear call from God and the approval of some proper authority, that's like your director or the confessor, is usually only a subtle form of self-seeking. There should be sufficient corporal penance to keep the body in subjection. Little things, just saying no to little things every day, That's Father Eugene Boylan I was quoting. Little things. That's what Lent helps us do. These 40 days of Lent prepare us. It's like a little basic training, but it carries us through the year. So we get a habit of having the power to say no to something. There's nothing wrong with sweets, but I'll have less of them. There's nothing wrong with this, but I'll do less of that. It's getting the power to say no to our body, so that we're in charge of our body and it's not dragging us around. So that's the fourth possible obstacle. And it's a formidable one if we don't have the virtue of temperance. Fifth possible obstacle, lack of interior mortification. Quote, Father Boylan, it must also always be remembered that it is by interior mortification of the memory, of the imagination, of the emotions, and by the ready acceptance of humiliations that the greatest and quickest progress is made. What does that mean? Well, he continues, to give free rein to one's thoughts, to indulge in reveries, to build castles in the air, to dwell constantly on old memories, to nurse one's grievances, to allow wounded pride to dictate one's thoughts or feelings. All such habits are far from being truly mortified. Close quote, Father Boylan. We can't nurse those old grudges. There's a saying, forgive and forget. We have to forgive. But the devil, at least, is going to make sure we don't forget. But when these things come up, we just drive them away. We say a little prayer for whomever, whatever the situation is, and we just drive them away. But we don't bathe in it and have some sort of morbid pity party with ourselves. For example, when we find ourselves getting angry at someone, we say a prayer for them and move our mind away and so forth. We have to mortify our interior moods, our interior thoughts. Okay, we have to move away from this sort of a thing where we don't want to have we need to have a Copernican revolution. We don't want to keep ourselves as the center of the universe with everything revolving around what we think. That's interior mortification. Sixth possible obstacle, we'll quote St. Alphonsus. Quote, lack of spiritual reading. The reading of pious works fills the soul with holy thoughts and good desires. The person who keeps the mind filled with devout thoughts, such as spiritual maxims, examples of the virtuous action of saints, will be kept almost always united with God. Close quote, St. Alphonsus. See, we're immersed in this fallen, disordered world. But we're meant, of course, to be headed towards heaven. If we don't spend some time filling our memory and our imagination with heavenly images, with holy thoughts, with holy images, then our memory and imagination will be filled with worldly thoughts and images. It's that simple. Either we fill our minds and our imaginations with heavenly and holy images and thoughts, or they'll be filled with worldly images and thoughts. It's that basic. If we spend all our time watching stuff that's trash, we're going to have trash in our mind. If we spend time reading good things and watching good things, we'll have good things in our mind. Now let's look in a little more detail at the seventh possible obstacle. Seventh possible obstacle is the lack of mental prayer. We'll rely on St. Alphonsus here with my editorial comments thrown in all over the place. St. Alphonsus, quote, all the saints became saints because of mental prayer. I'll repeat that. All the saints became saints because of mental prayer. All the saints became saints because of mental prayer. Mental prayer has three parts: preparation, meditation, conclusion. In the preparation, that's the first part, 3 acts: faith in the presence of God, humility, prayer for God's guidance. Second part, meditation. Read slowly, stop when something strikes us, make affections like, dear God, I love you and would do anything for you. My God, I love you above all things. You're the highest good, lacking in nothing. Make petitions, especially for the love of God. Make a particular resolution, such as to avoid a particular fault. Third part, conclusion. Thank God for the lights received. Resolve to follow our resolutions. Pray to the Father through Jesus and Mary for the grace to keep our resolution. Let's close. We've seen if we're not saints after our first Holy Communion, it's not because of any defect in our Lord. It's not because of any defect in our Lord. It's because of obstacles within us. We considered 7 common possible obstacles. First possible obstacle, mortal sin. Don't go to communion, mortal sin. Go to confession. Second possible obstacle, deliberate venial sin. Third possible obstacle, dodging the cross, lack of generosity in pursuing God's will. Fourth possible obstacle, lack of bodily mortification. Fifth possible obstacle, lack of interior mortification. Sixth possible obstacle, lack of spiritual reading. Why do we spend so much time on the seventh one? Because every one of these first six is solved or can be solved if we get serious about mental prayer. Mental prayer will get us the graces to overcome all the rest. Mental prayer. It is true that our holiness comes principally, the grace that we get in life comes principally through the sacraments, but the grace we get from the sacraments comes principally from our prayer life. It's what opens the floodgates. The prayer life will give us the grace to conquer any of these first six things that we're not doing. If we start mental prayer, the other things are going to go away. Mental prayer and sin can't stay together. They can't. Okay, so the seventh possible obstacle is the lack of mental prayer. All the saints became saints because of mental prayer. I would like to personally challenge everyone here. It's Lent. It's coming up. Take 15 minutes a day in mental prayer. It may seem like an eternity, and the devil will probably make it seem like that in the beginning if you don't have the habit. But start with 15 minutes a day. All the saints became saints because of mental prayer. It's an investment in your eternity. It's an investment in your happiness here, an investment in your happiness hereafter. All the saints become saints because of mental prayer. Get a book. Get started. We're here to become saints. This Lent, let's strive to remove every possible obstacle to our sanctification.